and educators for nationalism and democracy. At ang ating pong gawain ngayon, aktibidad natin ngayong tanghali ay mapapanood sa mga social media platforms, no? FB pages ng Contend, Act at Tanggol Kasaysayan. Ayan, kaninang umaga po, no, nag-start ang ating conference, no, sa pamamagitan ng pangunahing tagapagsalita natin na si Professor Jose Maria Sison sa kanyang Debunking Lies and Distortion About Martial Law Under Marcos. At ito po ay ma-access sa kanyang website, no, josemariasison.org. At ito rin po ay pwedeng i-post natin mamaya sa ating chat group, chat functions para po inyong ma-download. So after po noon, nagkaroon ng panel 1 on education at malaki po yung yung sinabi na magiging papel ng edukasyon, no? Lalo na sa panahon ngayon, no, ng misinformation, no, mga fake news, no, na pinapakalat, no? Kaya para po magpatuloy, no, ito po ngayon ay ang panel 2. Ito naman po ay ang Simbahan, Ekonomiya at Maralitang Tagalungsod, no? At siksik din po ang ating panel 2, no, dahil makikita po natin, no, paano ba pinabubulaanan dapat, no, yung palaging mga sinasabi na nung panahon ni Marcos napakaganda ng buhay, no, nung panahon ni Marcos nasa golden age tayo ng ating ekonomiya, no, at ano yung naging danas, no, ng mga taong simbahan at ng mga maralita, no, nung panahon ng martial law. So hindi ko na po pakatatagalin, no, on time po tayo ngayon, no, para po sa ating unang panelist, no, para po talakayin, no, ang church-state relationship during martial law in the Philippines from 1972 to 1986. Nandito po kasama po natin mula sa Movement Against Tyranny si Sister Mary Jan Mananzan.
Start. Can you hear me?
Yes po, sister.
I have a PowerPoint. So, can I share screen?
Yes po. Pwede na po. Naka-co-host na po kayo.
Okay. Sandali lang. Nakikita niyo po ba?
Yes po, sister.
Sige. So, ang aking assignment is church state under martial law. So, may historical background siyempre yan. As you know, Ferdinand Marcos was elected 6th President of the Republic of the Philippines in 1965, and he was re-elected again in 1969. But at this time talagang nagkakaroon na ng political crisis, no? Parang sabi nga ng itong mga author na si Mario Bulasco at saka si Rolly, the crisis steered the slumbering giant of rebellion and protest into a frenzy. State attempts to suppress the frenzy drove it to the pitch of rage. This entanglement of the knot was out of the question. Martial law was the harsh sword that seems to cut it. No? So the martial law was declared on actually September 23 declared, but the document is September 21. And although it was lifted officially in 1981, actually it did not really end there. Marcos was thrown out of office only in February 1986 as the result of the people's power in the so-called First EDSA Revolution. So now I go to the topic, the relationship of this church and state. Now there are two important developments which determine the nature of state relationship under martial law. One is political. The development of the liberation movement, no? As you know, there was the National Liberation Movement already. And the other is the ecclesiastical in the church, the Second Vatican Council, and the development of a socially oriented theology. The Second Vatican Council made us aware of the modern world and what are the different issues that were confronting the church. So we have the Second Vatican Council that ended in 1965. So this is very important for our topic. So, and also, as I said, the National Liberation Movement, because there was the successful revolution in 1949 of the Chinese, and it inspired anti-imperialist wars in many Asian countries, notably North Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia. In the Philippines, it gave rise to the resurgence of militant nationalism in the mid-60s. There was the reestablishment of the Communist Party of the Philippines by militant students of the University of the Philippines in 1968. And I think you listened to Joma, who was the chairperson of the Communist Party for a long time. Shortly after the re-election of Marcos in 1969, the country was rocked by a series of mass actions organized and participated in by workers, peasants, students, intellectuals. Scores were killed and thousands were injured and still more incarcerated. So, yung ginagawa nga yung historical distortion, I never call it revision. I say historical distortion kasi talagang it is distorted, not just revised, no? Na wala daw nangyari, it's the golden age and all that. The victims who are still alive up to now can tell us that is hardly so, no? That it has to be taken note. So you have towards the theology of struggle and the rise of the CPP, NPA, and the F. Now, the Vatican II brought the church face to face with the problems of modern world, including massive poverty and injustice, no? That is in the Vatican II. But even after the Vatican II, Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Populorum Progressio, concretized the general principles of Vatican II and rooted its critique and solution on concrete situations in the contemporary world. This is a real, what do you call this, radical transformation of the church from heavenly things, as if there is nothing else but heaven and something. But now the church was confronted with the situation of poverty and misery in the world, and the church people realized that they have to confront this situation and not only thinking of going to heaven, no? So what really inspired church people to involve themselves in the political struggle of the poor in the Philippines was the programmatic statement in the document Justice in the World, produced by the Synod of Bishops in 1971. I remember we took this up in our Priory chapter also, and we adopted this programmatic statement. And it says very clearly, action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the proclamation of the gospel, or in other words, of the church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. This is very important. In other words, the church is saying, even though you are preaching and preaching so many homilies, but if you are not acting on behalf of justice and transformation of the world, you are not actually preaching the gospel. Now, that is a very, very heavy and very consequent statement. And I remember that is the reason why, everybody knows I am activist and being red tagged. That is precisely the reason why I'm an activist, no? Because Christ, according to this, has a predilection for the poor, and therefore, if I'm a follower of Christ, I must also be in solidarity with the poor. And if the poor and the oppressed are oppressed and exploited, then I must be on their side, not only in words but in actions. That is the inspiration of Christians in what is called now activism or parliament of the streets, no? So the emerging theology of struggle, of course, this theology of struggle is actually a Philippine version of the theology of liberation that, as you know, started in and developed in Latin America. So the emerging theology of struggle that was being developed by activist priests and nuns, inspired by the liberation theology of Latin America, took this programmatic statement as their battle cry in their commitment to be in solidarity with the poor and the oppressed, struggling for the rights under the oppressive conditions of martial law. So, when martial law was declared in 1972, all militant organizations were rounded up and many went underground. this left the church as the only remaining institution of political significance, no? But of course, it was sorely divided. Prior to Vatican II, the church was more or less united by doctrinal orthodoxy, but the council gave rise to pluralism, not only in theology, but also in social praxis. In 1975, a newsletter, Buyer's Report, published by the AMRSP, that is Association of Major Religious Superiors of the Philippines, classified 4 response patterns of church people to martial law. This is in their statement in the Philippine perspective in its moral and political dimensions. This is what I'm going to explain to you. These 4 response patterns of church people to martial law. Okay, the first one is non-critical involvement. What does that mean? It means involvement without criticism. According to this, the church teaches the major premises of charity, justice, and peace, but it refrains from pointing out in the concrete situation whether or not these social qualities are present. The church cannot take sides in politics but embrace all men. That is sexist language in charity. That's why I put sick, no? So that is that side of the church. However, this posture in effect meant outright cooperation with the government because non-critical involvement. In 1976, a political analyst identified Julio Cardinal Rosales and 15 bishops as belonging to this category. They constituted the hardcore loyalist group in the hierarchy. They would occasionally be invited by the president for briefings and were called upon to grace public functions of the government. So this is the first, the non-critical involvement. The second is the non-critical collaboration, no? So this is now non-critical collaboration. This group regarded support of the government as all right, except when the government violated traditional concerns like family planning, abortion, divorce. An example of this stance was the pronouncement of the late Cardinal Santos that Marcos' new society was in accord with the Sermon on the Mount and the new commandment of love, and therefore should be hailed and welcomed by every peace-loving citizen. Another is the statement made by a presiding archbishop at the presidential palace on the installation of a domestic prelate. Taking the letter to the Romans chapter 13 as starting point, the archbishop exhorted the people to habitual obedience to the state, giving the government the benefit of the doubt that it means well for the people. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry, that first one is still number 1 pala. Okay. The second stance is the critical collaboration. So yung first one is non-critical, no? But the second one, although they are collaborating, there is already some kind of critique. This is the stance of another group in the hierarchy who denounced injustices from the pulpit, but stopped at denunciation and did not follow it by corresponding actions. There have been actually several critical pronouncements coming from the church. You can see that in their documents. There was the pastoral letter on evangelization and development, which pointed to the roots of underdevelopment in the Philippines, in the foreign control of Philippine economy, which is correct, very correct. It showed really what is the root cause of poverty and injustice in the Philippines. But this did not translate into effective action on the part of the hierarchy. Again, there was a statement made by the CBCP, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, on 1975 referendum, declaring openly that there prevailed an unjust situation. But action-wise, the bishops concentrated on the sacramental functions of the church, you know, baptism, confession, holy matrimony, etc., etc. So wala pa rin pakialam, although they already see that there is something wrong, no? Now, Cardinal Sin protested against the PDA 23 banning strikes. So his position is, as Christians, we have a bounden duty to fight injustice. But as followers of Christ, we cannot fight injustice with arms. So instead of guns and bullets, we use our pens and our voices to seek justice. No? Now, concerning protest action, he states, my position on this point has never altered. If a priest has violated the law, then justice demands that he should be brought to trial. And so long as the trial is speedy and fair and open, I will not complain. No? So Jaime Cardinal Sin, this was printed in a newsletter, June 23, 1979. So, okay. So, the summary of the number 2 option. So, the dilemma of Cardinal Sin consists in the fact that on one hand, his respect for the law prods him to acquiesce, to keep silent, to the arrest of clerics as long as there is due process. He was very clear about that. But ang dilemma niya kasi is that on the other hand, it seems that he will be constrained to complain as the legal basis of the arrest is by his, kasi nakikita niya that the legal basis of the arrest by his own admission is a law that is so ambiguous that almost anything and everything that displeases the powers can be interpreted as subversive. Parang ngayon din, no? So, meron siyang he wants to obey the law, due process, etc. Pero alam naman niya na yung law na nagpapairal ay talaga namang unfair and unjust kasi parang overall, parang everything na critical ay kasalanan sa gobyerno. Which reminds you of today, di po ba? Ngayon, okay, the third one is critical stance. No? According to this posture, the church cannot be satisfied with teaching through words alone. One has to organize, to work with groups, perhaps even to identify with specific social classes. And believe it or not, a group of 17 bishops who call themselves critical minority explained their position. No? According to them, the division in the hierarchy, moment. I'm sorry, nawala. I'm sorry, hindi ko na kasi. Sorry ha. So this is already, no, this is wrong. I am sorry, what happened to this? Okay, so there's really a critical minority that said that it's not enough to make critical, how do you call this, documents, but there has to be action, no? On this basis, what martial law was doing to people was the crucial question, and according to them, what it was doing was a massive injustice compounded by deceit and wholesale manipulation of a people by a dehumanizing fear that comes with the power of the gun. So you can see very heavy ang critic nila sa martial law, no? And of course all the actuations. Okay, the one that exemplified most is not anymore the hierarchy, but there is this association of the major religious superiors, no? Sandali lang po. Ay, nako. Okay, the association of major religious supported farmers and laborers by lending its facilities to them and funding their seminars. They put up task forces who took care of various concerns from minorities to political detainees and education of religious. I know because at that time, I was the chairperson of the task force for the conscientization of church personnel. And we went to all over the Philippines in order to show what is the situation of the Philippines and what should be our stance as church. So it is the AMRSP really who was the one spearheading this critical position, and not only by words, but actually by actions, no? So the posture of the MRSP did not only anger the government, but also they were also criticized by the conservative segment of the hierarchy, no? Even the Sacred Congregation of Religious and Secular Institute of the Vatican already reprimanded them for their open opposition to the hierarchy. I remember at that time, the chairperson of the women was Christine Tan. So she's a actually, Christine Tan would be one of the people that were interviewed by Pete Lacaba, and kami tatlo actually, si anong pangalan nito, Sister Mariani, na in-interview kami, and then they put it together into a composite person, and that is what you have the ano yung kay pangalan no, yung sine, no, na you know all that about the nun who became an activist. So now, but of course there were still parang ano what they call this, different stance, even though, because some of them mostly individual church workers, religious priests, and even bishops who were open to alliance with the Marxists because they perceived the situation under martial law to be irreformable by peaceful means. They formed an organization called Christians for National Liberation. Ito yung nag-develop ng theology of struggle. So there was the CNL, as it was called, no? Now, the areas of conflict between the church and state would expand and intensify to such an extent as to pave the way to the final confrontation. And there is no doubt that the church, and particularly Cardinal Sin, who would earn the epithet Grey Eminence for his role, would play an important part in the so-called EDSA revolution, which resulted in the toppling of the Marcos regime. So iyon lang po ang so makikita nyo ang stance of the church iba-iba. May uncritical, meron critical collaboration, merong talagang they wanted to really have a critical stance not only in words but in action, and some even went as far to the extent of saying that they do not mind working together with the Marxist the National Liberation Movement. So ito po yung church stance during martial law. It was not a united church stance, but it was really according to the commitment and according to the way individual bishops or priests or nuns taught. Thank you po. That's all.
Maraming salamat po, Sister Mary Jan, no, sa detalyadong pagbaybay, no, nung stand ng ating simbahan, no, lalo na nung panahon ng martial law. Mukhang masusubok na naman po ulit ang simbahan, no, sa paparating na eleksyon, no. Kaya po bago natin tawagan yung susunod na tagapagsalita, yung mga tanong po for Sister Mary Jan ay reserve po natin, no, after po ng presentation ng tatlong mga panelists, tsaka po natin bubuksan yung open forum natin. Pero bago po muna